Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hi everyone. Today I just want to talk about one very common strategy used, by basically everyone who eventually becomes a tyrant and wipes out an entire demographic or tries to destroy, an entire group of people. It's usually through a narrative that they follow where they claim victimization, you know. And we see this, we often are not taught or not told that the precursor to every massacre, to every type of mass discrimination against any one particular group of people, genocide, etc., throughout history, is victimization. And I don't mean victimization, against the people who are eventually massacred, but actually quite the opposite. Usually what happens is a group of people portray themselves as being victimized, and the victim, as it were, in most narratives, is therefore legitimate, or their actions are legitimized, in opposition to the victimization that they suffer. Okay, and we see this happening, time and time again. One example would be, Germany in the time of Hitler. I mean, if you really think about it carefully, how was Hitler able to mobilize all those Germans, with, the idea or around the idea that the Jews were oppressing them? How was he able to do that? How was he able to unite an entire nation against a population that he demarcated, or a group of people that he demarcated as the villain? How was he able to do that? He was able to do that because, he told Germans, he portrayed a narrative that Germans were actually the victims of Jewish control, of the economy, and that the poverty they were suffering was as a result of the oppression they were suffering at the hands of Jews. And so therefore to exterminate these Jews were, in their minds, justified. And that is generally the narrative of victimization that is followed. And so we see this also playing out with terrorism in our time, where you find, for example, terrorists portraying mass murder, mass shootings, bombings of people in places of worship, in malls, and so on. And they justify this essentially by focusing on a narrative that shows their suffering and shows the great injustices that were done to them. And so therefore they have this right to lash out and kill innocent people, because these innocent people are not so innocent after all, because they belong to the demographic or group, that are benefiting from the tyranny that these terrorists, are suffering, or the people of these terrorists are suffering from, in their own territories, or in whichever way they see themselves as the victim. And so there is a real evil to this constant portrayal of people, or people portraying themselves specifically as victims. And the evil is that they often become the mass murderers of tomorrow. And so, finally, I want to apply this narrative to feminism, because feminism portrays women as being the victims of the tyrannical patriarchy, and that men have throughout history, under the tyrannical patriarchy, oppressed women up until now, where women have to some extent triumphantly uh, managed to secure some rights for them, and now are almost equal to men. So there's this narrative, that men are the enemy, men are out to get women, men are out to oppress women, etc. Okay? This is obviously a victimization attitude. It's women, uh, portraying themselves as victims, and it's so ingrained, it's become such a, almost like a religion, it's almost like a sacred a discourse, that anyone who goes out there and says actually women are not victims, they get called misogynists, they get gunned down, because how dare you say women are not victims? And why is it so disliked, so frowned on, so hated when someone points out that women are actually not always the victims, and that men can also equally be victims? Why is that such a hated narrative? It's because it undermines, the very premise, the very springboard on which feminists, set out to destabilize the social structure of, societies and the way they function, and also the very premise on which they allow themselves the right to undermine and oppress men. And that's right, that is what feminists, along with governments, collectively in the West do. They basically undermine and oppress men, because on one hand, they demand of men everything that traditional society demanded of men. On the other hand, they don't accord men any of the necessary respect, authority, and right to behave in any particular or any traditional format. So a man then just becomes a donor, basically a sperm donor, and then he becomes a financial a backer, of a family that essentially does not belong to him. And so it creates no incentive for him, and it's not a no wonder that men are opting out. Men are saying no, we don't want families, we don't want marriage, we don't want all these things, because it's not worth it at the end of the day. And so this war that's going on, against men, especially real men, traditional men, men who want to be men, is a war that, in some ways it's being lost. Men are losing this war because men have to constantly apologize for being men. Men have to constantly, accommodate, the female imperative, increasingly, which is taking over every sphere of life, and where men feel themselves being backed in a corner and having no place to go. And this is even happening nowadays. In some places they're even trying to take over the mosques. God forbid they do that, where men will not even be able to retreat to the mosque to find peace of mind, to just be away from having to tiptoe around women constantly, because that's essentially what it is in the end. men having to tiptoe around women, and not only now do they have to tiptoe around women in the homes as they always had to do, but now they have to tiptoe around women in the workplace, tiptoe around women on the streets, and tiptoe around women in the places of worship. And so men basically have no place to be. Thank you very much.